Well, one of my favorite topics is history, especially ancient history. And since I am an anarcho-capitalist and into libertarianism, there's a certain tendency for me to want to gravitate towards state formation and early state formation, which is really frustrating because most scholars who are professionals at early state formation aren't libertarians at all. Most of them are not very concerned about political ideology, and to the extent that they have any, it's kind of a quasi-Marxism. Not because they're really Marxists, just because that's the kind that's most prominent in a lot of the fields that they come from. Uh, so we don't really get a libertarian perspective or a view of a critical view of state formation. There's a tendency kind of to view things as somewhat deterministic and say, well, that's just progress. That's a progression of human society is to develop states at some point, and so that's either a neutral phenomenon or that's a laudable phenomenon. Of course, the other problem, not ideological at all, is just that there is very little information available. If we're talking 3500 BC and before, there's tiny little, very little to go off of, and it can only tell us so much. Artifacts, while a single piece of information can tell us a lot, it can't even begin to color the palette of a human society. And so it is kind of a frustrating field. But one thing I've always found interesting was the fact that state formation is a relatively recent phenomenon. Uh, as far as we're aware, uh, physically modern humans have been around a long time. It depends who you ask. Uh, there's a lot of people who think that even though there's no evidence in the fossil record, that there seems to be some kind of revolution in thinking that maybe took place 30,000 years ago, give or take, maybe 70,000 years ago. In terms of the evolution of the body type, we're talking at least 150,000 years ago or 250,000 years ago, a long time. But when we talk about states, the first states that we feel comfortable calling states was like the Nakata 2 levels in Egypt, which again we're talking 3000 to 2000 BC. Or, I'm sorry, like 3500 to 3000 BC, and in Iraq, in the Euphrates and Tigris river valleys in southern Iraq, especially Uruk, Ur, and same time frame, perhaps a little bit earlier. Uh, what's interesting is that large populations of humans seem to predate that and to have existed in other places. Even settlement seems to predate that by quite a bit. And well, I don't think that there can ever be a complete theory. One thing I think is interesting that kind of occurred to me, I was watching Junior Bacon Chi make a video. He was making a video response to somebody who was very overweight and was asking for help. And I'm not a dietitian, so I can't really offer any aid that way. But what Junior Bacon Cheese was recommending was basically the Primal diet. Now, I read LouRockwell.com, but not that often. But it's my understanding, based on conversations that I've had with several people, that LouRockwell.com has essentially been pimping out the so-called Primal diet. And I did see the video where Tom Woods basically said, "I've been losing weight," which I had actually noticed. I had noticed that he was losing weight, and he said, "I'm doing the Primal diet." And the two kind of made me have a little bit of an epiphany of thinking perhaps there's a relationship between the two. I had known for a long time that if you go to pre-Neolithic, so Mesolithic and Paleolithic humans, and you go to hunter-gatherer societies in more recent times that were not agricultural, they tended to be healthier on net when they weren't starving than agriculturalists. So, uh, a friend of mine was telling me that he had heard, and I don't know, this is not something I heard so explicit, but when they find skeletons that are real healthy, they can typically say that they are from the the pre-Neolithic era. Neolithic is when agriculture kind of became a big deal. And for the point of this video, that's when grain consumption became a much bigger part of the diet. Prior to that, we still ate all kinds of vegetables. No one should ever think that there was a period where we were strict carnivores. Never. In fact, meat was almost always likely a major, an important fraction of our diet. But it would have been more natural root vegetables and fruits and that sort of thing, and not grains. Grain intense. Uh, the grains, the staple grains that feed most of the world today only naturally occur in a few places, and the humans that inhabited those places used them only as a mild substitute. And it wasn't until they were forced by very likely some type of climate change into intensive cultivation that grains became really, really important staple to the diet. And again, only in certain regions, especially the Jordan River Valley and the Euphrates and the Tigris River valleys. Um, the first people, as anthropologists dub them, are that did this in a significant way were the so-called Natufians. They lived around 10,000 BC. Maybe it's 10,000 years ago now. I think it's 10,000 BC, so 12,000 years ago. And they were hunter-gatherers. They ate, they hunted gazelle, and this is in Asia, but they were back then. They were gazelle and cheetah and all manner of animals that we associate all strictly with Africa today. And they also would harvest grain. Basically, the progenitors of wheat and barley grew back then wildly, and they started carrying these little stone scythes, these little blades that are for harvesting, and they would just do this during the harvest. When that was ripe, they would go, and that was a supplement to their diet. And then there was a massive climate shift, and basically the Middle East became much more arid than it is today. Prior to that, it was much lusher than it is today, and it became really a terrible place. And so the population was forced to migrate to the stable water sources, so specifically the river valleys. So here we're talking the Nile, the Jordan, the Euphrates, the Tigris. And these areas are too small to support the game populations that all the people concentrated in those areas would need, and so they had to turn to an intensive cultivation of grains in order to survive. And I do recall just reading in other books, there's a book called The First Armies that talks about, when they look at skeletons from, say, Egypt from Nakata on, it's really quite pitiful. These people were very, very unhealthy. Their bones show enormous wear and enormous lack of nutrients. But they said, but if they didn't, because the whole life of farming was extremely hard, and yet you didn't get a ton of healthy, good food out of it. You just got almost empty calories. But the problem was, if you didn't go to that extreme, you'd starve to death. And so, faced with the choice of eating a really nice, varied, healthy diet and starving to death, people will decide to become agriculturalists. Now, when I watched Junior Bacon Cheese's video, it occurred to me that maybe the fact that the intensive cultivation of grains uh, happened in the exact same areas where the first states arose, and in a time frame where it is plausible that the intensive cultivation of grains precedes the formation of states, I wonder if the two have a causal relationship, if it's not the fact that the diet change that made humans susceptible to statism in a way that hunter-gatherers are not. And I don't think this could ever be proven, but I think it is interesting, because if we do look at history, hunter-gatherer societies tend to be anarchists, and they tend to have a lot harder time being succumbing to statism. Statism very much is associated with agriculture. Even today, there are areas in the world that, though they technically fall within the borders of states, the people who live in them are essentially stateless. You look at like the Eskimos, or the Somni, the Siberian, the Eskimo equivalents in Siberia. They're basically nomadic or semi-nomadic. the caribou or walrus or whatever, and they're not very susceptible to being governed. Same is true if we look in North America. The Mesoamericans ate staples, they ate corn primarily, and they were heavily statified. And also that made them very, very susceptible to European conquest, by the way. They fell much quicker and easier to the Spanish than did the anarchist, more hunter-gatherer natives in North America. And also they were healthier. In fact, just a year or two ago, there was a study that came out that for the first time in 120 years, Americans were not the tallest people in the world. The Dutch had just surpassed the Americans. The Americans had been the tallest people in the world up until the 1870s, but the people that the Americans displaced in the 1870s were the Lakota Sioux. The Lakota Sioux were the tallest people uh, prior to that. And I don't know who was before them. They probably weren't keeping records that long prior to that. And I think it's interesting uh, that that's the case. I would also point out that if you look at America also, uh, the early American colonies were, uh, among many differences they had with Europe, was that there was a great increase in the dietary variety of the average American. The average European was in some level a peasant or serf and eating primarily some kind of staple crop, and would only on occasion ever have eaten meat or fruit or anything like that. Uh, Once you get past the very, very early colonies, past the first decade or even less, you start to see that by and large, starvation doesn't really happen in any large scale in the United States. And most people, including poor people, in fact, even slaves, had access to meat. I know I have a book called The Sovereign States, and it talks a lot about the economy and the politics, and how even slaves would often be able to eat meat. You'd have people who would be able to have domesticated beef and domesticated chickens and pork, but also supplemented by wild game, deer, turkeys. Uh, in the South, most of the cattle were actually semi-feral. Uh, but I wonder if that wasn't part of it, because if you listen to the dietitians, and again, I'm not a dietitian, the proponents of this primal diet will basically say that, if you eat all these carbohydrates, all these grain-heavy, bread, rice, corn, that not only does it make you fat and lazy, but I think it makes you less keen. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if the shift in the diet away from look, there's nothing, if you're going to starve to death, go ahead and eat carbohydrates. Like, I don't want to be this revisionist and say everything was fine in the Mesolithic period, because yeah, individuals were healthy, but their societies could only stay in very, very small populations. So I'm not saying it was bad that there was a shift to agriculture. But what I am saying is that that shift to agriculture, the actual diet itself, may have made people more susceptible to states, something that had not arisen before. We don't have states in the Mesolithic. And actually, for about half the Neolithic, we don't have states either. It's something that seems to require a cereal diet. And now there are other reasons why agriculture would make statism easier. If you have a nomadic or a semi-nomadic lifestyle and you're divided in all these moving bands, it's very hard to be governed physically. It's much easier to govern people physically if they are in one spot, concentrated. Even today, the government is much more powerful in big urban centers than it is in rural areas. I mean, orders of magnitude different. That's not to say that if you live in the country, that you're safe from the government, but it has much less power. And so if you have societies that are uh, more diverse and based on game or whatever, regardless of the dietary consequences of what they eat, it's harder for states to arise or to exist if they are established. But I think even beyond that, just the change in the diet actually may make it harder. And like I said, uh, even in more contemporary societies, not going back thousands and thousands of years, we see that the hunter-gatherers are very hard to be made subservient the States. And you also look at the United States, where finally we get to the point where, because of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, we can actually have a primal diet and not live in primal bands. You and I, and even very poor people in the United States, if they want to, can have as much meat as they can eat. We don't have to live on the cheap grains, and we haven't actually ever. I mean, Americans have. It's really one of those things. People like to be nationalists and think that they're all extraordinary or whatever, and it's actually little things like that that make the biggest difference. If you read about a lot of books about, say, the Revolution, will point this out, that Americans, maybe they were bitching about the English, but your average American had it a lot better than your average Briton did. They had more land, they had more freedom, they had better diets, blah blah blah. They were taxed less, and this is still the case. And one wonders if that didn't contribute in some way. If you take all these Englishmen, let's say, who grow up mostly as in some degree of peasantry, in some degree of serfdom, which is not literally true with every single person who came here, but having a diet of barley or wheat, and then they come to the United States and they'll still grow barley and wheat, and that's still an important product, but they'll eat turkey too, and they'll eat deer, and there's room enough to have cows grazing and to have lots of milk and meat stuff. These are rare, expensive items in Europe that you would not have incorporated into your diet in any kind of regular way. Whereas in the United States, it's a regular thing to have that kind of meal. And then your grains become more of a supplement, or to make beer out of, or whiskey. And one wonders if that wasn't a big part in the transformation from Englishmen into Americans, into people who were considerably less likely to kowtow to the state. Now, there are other reasons for that. I mean, there's a self-selecting process of only the more libertarian, anti-authoritarian people are going to immigrate. And also there's the practical fact that there's so much more space here that you have to be more individualistic to survive. And if the state does want to crack down on you, it's that much harder because you're dispersed. But I do think it's interesting. I don't think it can be proven. But look, we see that the first states did not arise. I mean, agriculture is possible everywhere. If you look today, the most agricultural areas are not Mesopotamia, are not Egypt. They're in the mid-latitude so-called grain belts, like in the Great Plains of the United States and in the Ukraine. Uh, but and of course, people lived. I mean, there are people who lived in the Great Plains 10,000 years ago, and there are people who lived in the Great Plains of Ukraine 10,000 years ago. But the grains that are edible to humans do not grow there naturally, and they didn't. So the people who lived there were even though they lived in land that would eventually be mass cultivated in agriculture, they were eating a hunter-gatherer diet, which again is not pure meat. That's a big myth. Is that just means you're eating mammoth and whatever? No, but you're not eating grains. You're eating vegetables and small game mostly, not mammoth so much. And it's only in the areas where grains occur naturally that we get states. And also, and the other interesting thing is we have large settlements. We have agriculture doesn't predate settled living. If you look at some of the sites like in Turkey, like Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük, large towns, thousands and thousands of permanent inhabitants, and yet no states. I mean, every anthropologist I've ever heard, all the experts about those places say that there's no states there. In fact, they term them as egalitarian. And what was their diet? Their diet was a hunter-gatherer diet. They were eating game, basically gazelles, wild pigs, wild horses, that sort of thing. Not grain. So they had cities, what we could call cities, basically large sedentary populations, but no states. But then when you get those same areas, or in this case a little bit south, because Göbekli Tepe is in basically Anatolia, and the first states are arising south of there a few hundred miles. You have permanent settlements, but instead of hunter-gatherer type food, they are eating grain. They're eating grain. They're grinding it into meal, making bread out of it. and that's where states happen. So maybe this whole primal diet, maybe that's the secret of the government. I don't know. I haven't tried it. I was talking to a friend of mine. He was swearing by the book, but we'll see what happens. So anyway, that's it.